I wanted to thank everybody for being here today. I'd really like to see everyone here. Before we get started, I'd like to first introduce myself. I am Zach Schreiner. I'm the current editor-in-chief of the Energy Law Journal. And I'd also like to recognize at this point the new members of the Energy Law Journal, specifically the members of the editorial board. This is Kyle Miller. He's going to be taking over next year. Scott Morgan is going to be the executive notes and comments editor, executive articles editor, and Eric Nykar is going to be the executive notes and comments editor. They were recently chosen over the weekend, and when you have a chance, please congratulate them. I'd also like to thank Professor Butkin for helping bring Ms. Sullivan here to speak with all of us today about climate change. We're very fortunate to have him as an asset to our university, and very fortunate to have Ms. Sullivan here as well. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Butkin so he can introduce Mrs. Sullivan. Thank you.
Zach, I want to thank you and your colleagues on the Energy Law Journal for all the work you did to make it possible to bring such a wonderful speaker to us today. Mary Ann Sullivan was born in Albany, New York. She was educated at Fordham University and received her bachelor's summa cum laude, majoring in metaphysics. Upon graduating from Yale Law School, she commenced her wonderful private practice career, very distinguished private practice career at Hogan and Hartson, one of the world's leading private practice law firms. And like many of you, if not all of you, she has done a wonderful job combining her service to her clients with a career that has also had a wonderful complement in public service to all of us. From 94 to 98, during the Clinton administration, she served as Deputy General Counsel for Environmental and Nuclear Programs and Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy. And from 98 to 2001, the last 4 years of the Clinton administration, she served as General Counsel to the Department of Energy. She has taught energy law at Duke Law School and George Washington University Law School. And I've known Mary Ann for 30 years. In fact, I've known you for more years than we were alive at the date I first met you, Mary Ann. She is a wonderful and dear friend and mentor. I said earlier that Mary Ann's undergraduate major was metaphysics, and metaphysics can be described as the ultimate study of reality beyond the known world. And she has promised to come back next year to deliver a lecture on that subject. But as we all know, the problems in the known world are keeping all of us busy and challenged right now. And I don't think any individual that I've known has used her talents more effectively to address the challenges of the known world, as has Mary Ann Sullivan, particularly in the important challenges we face in the fields of energy and climate change. It's a real personal pleasure to welcome Mary Ann again to the state of Oklahoma. She's been here on numerous occasions, and to give her an opportunity to share her vision, her insights, her ethics and integrity, commitment to public service with the community that I see in front of me. Please welcome an outstanding practitioner, public servant, teacher, and mentor, Mary Ann Sullivan.
Robert, that introduction only reinforces what I told the dean a few minutes ago, which is I've never felt better treated since the time I got off the airplane yesterday afternoon. Everybody has been absolutely terrific. I want to give a special thanks to the Energy Law Journal, who is sponsoring me and who has just been terrific. And I want to thank all of you for coming today. I think this is a really important subject that we're here to talk about. I do have to say that I knew I was in the law school when I arrived a few minutes early, and the back rows were all filled to capacity, and those who come later are filling in the front. I always arrived early in my law school classes, so I would get one of those prized seats in the back, so I feel right at home that the ethic and the culture of law school lives on. So let's turn to our topic for today. I called my talk Climate Change and the New Face of Energy. I think the challenge of climate change really does require some adjustments in the way we use energy and in the kind of energy we use. Let me just suggest that I want this to be a meaningful discussion. I don't want it to just be a one-way street. But what I would propose to make sure that we get the fullest picture and then have a real discussion is interrupt me if I say something you don't understand, if I use jargon that's not meaningful, if you just don't get it. But then let's save the substantive questions and the discussion for the end. I have kind of a story I want to tell, and so I think the questions will help wrap that up well. But let's start with what I'm going to cover. I think it's important that we all start with a common factual background and understanding. So I'm going to have a few slides that just show where we are in the world of greenhouse gas emissions, both globally and domestically. And then I'm going to have some data on the connection between energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a pretty close connection. We're sitting here in a law school. We're going to talk about, okay, what has the legal response been to climate change to date? We sometimes think the U.S. hasn't responded. In fact, there have been lots of responses, and we ought to know what those are and understand what they're doing. Then we're going to look at the evolution of energy. Energy has really already started to move in how it's responding to climate change. The energy outlook, if we don't take some additional steps beyond the ones that have already been taken. What some of the key issues are in federal climate legislation, which I expect we're going to see debated in the Congress later this year, and frankly I expect into next year. And then I'm going to finish up with a slide that's just my vision of the energy future. Everybody's entitled to their own, but I have one slide that wraps up my picture. So let's start, though, with the statement of the problem. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is comprised of thousands of scientists from around the world, reached the conclusion that to avoid the most damaging impacts of climate change, the world should limit atmospheric concentrations of CO2 and CO2 equivalents to 500 parts per million, plus or minus 50 parts per million, a little less than double the CO2 concentration of pre-industrial age of 280 parts per million. So the scientists are saying we can get to almost double where the world was to start with, but they're very worried if we get beyond double. Since this statement, many scientists have said that the 500 parts per million is too high a number. I heard on Tulsa Public Radio this morning that some scientists now think we have only a 50-50 chance of achieving the results we need to avoid these most damaging impacts. So it is a real live problem today. Long-term CO2 trends, and this is the global picture. What you see in the yellow line is what the total atmospheric concentrations have been of greenhouse gas concentration, CO2 concentration, starting in before 1750, so going way, way back before the Industrial Revolution. And then you see with the blue line the anthropogenic emissions. This is what has man and woman, through our activities, been contributing to atmospheric concentrations. And the interesting point, obviously, is that since 1950, you see a very, very close coordination between what human beings are adding to atmospheric concentrations and the total atmospheric concentrations. That was data going back to 1750. This goes back to 2004. So climate change has been a subject for public debate really since 1990. It's been actively, publicly debated. And so just since 2004, when it's been on the front page, you see continuing trend of increases, and really a pretty sharp increase. The pink line, or maybe it looks red to you, those reflect seasonal variations, but the blue line is the overall trend. It's not a good trend. I said we'd look at what the domestic picture is, and really the important thing, as we think about this from the perspective of energy, the important thing on this chart is to see what the contribution is from carbon dioxide, because that is the principal emission associated with using energy. And the message of this slide is CO2 is really pretty much the whole story. We get some methane from landfills, and we actually have some good technology for controlling that. It's staying pretty steady, but the CO2 is really the main picture and what we need to address. Another version of the domestic picture, and I don't know how well you can see on the map, but what this shows is since 1990, only 2 states have achieved emissions decreases, greenhouse gas emissions decreases. The whole rest of the country, I apologize that Hawaii and Alaska are not represented here. Blame it on EPA, it's their map, not mine. But the important thing to note is that 1990 is when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change reached the conclusion that this was an urgent problem that needed to be addressed. So since we were told that this is an urgent problem, everybody except Massachusetts and Delaware has been headed in the wrong direction. This chart is interesting because it puts in very stark terms just how big the problem is in much of the country. These are the top 15 states in greenhouse gas emissions increases since 1990 by percent. So Nevada and Arizona, large growth in those states since 1990. It's not terribly surprising that you would see those up at the top of the list. New Hampshire has a lot of Massachusetts escapees, so they've had a lot of economic growth. But once you get past those top 3, it's a much more mixed picture, and yet they have very large increases. Vermont, the Green Mountain State, 29% increase in its greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. Missouri, a state that has lost a lot of its industrial base, 34% increase. So a lot of bad news on this slide, and a stark message of how big the challenge is, it seems to me. The slides we've been looking at so far have been overall emissions. This is just from transportation. And the interesting thing about this map is not a single state has experienced a reduction in its greenhouse gas emissions from transportation since 1990. Everybody's on the upswing. So where are all these greenhouse gas emissions coming from? And this pie chart is intended to show you that coal-fired power plants are far and away the largest contributor other than transportation. I saw just the other day that Oklahoma has announced they will build no more new coal plants until we get a handle on how to do carbon capture and sequestration. So that's a response right here in this state, very current, to a recognition that coal-fired power plants are a huge part of the CO2 emissions problem in the U.S. and elsewhere in the world, by the way. Transportation comes in a strong second. After that, everything else is much, much smaller. I would point out that this graph does not illustrate that 40% of emissions are associated with buildings. So if we got a handle on building technology and made buildings much more energy efficient, we'd have much less electricity use, we'd have less emissions associated with heating and cooling, and that would be a big part of the problem. This is intended to show by industrial sector, so it just doesn't call the building situation out separately. So the sobering facts that we have to deal with here: fossil fuels, the source of greenhouse gas emissions, provide more than 70% of our power in the U.S. today. This is electricity only that we're talking about now. 2007 was the year of Al Gore's famous movie, An Inconvenient Truth. That year, climate change was on the front page at least once a week. And that year, greenhouse gas emissions from electricity increased almost 3%. So we were being told every day what the problem was, and the response was greenhouse gas emissions continued to increase quite sharply. The Energy Information Administration is the arm of the U.S. Department of Energy that keeps track of energy statistics. And it tries to do it in a very politically neutral way. And so it continually makes 25-year projections on where we're going on energy use in a whole array of sources. Where's our power going to come from? Where's our transportation energy going to come from? But one of the things they do in an effort to be policy and politically neutral is they do not assume any change in law. So even if everybody thinks there's going to be legislation, until it's actually enacted, they don't take it into account in their predictions. I say that because I'm going to use a couple of EIA statistics as we go through here. But the important thing to recognize about this EIA prediction of 25% growth in electricity demand by 2030 is it is only assuming, this is for their 2009 annual energy outlook, they only assume the efficiency measures, the carbon limitations, and so forth that are actually in place today. So here we've got 70% of today's power is coming from greenhouse gas emitting electricity, and we're facing a 25% growth in the use of power in the U.S. And we have the Obama administration and many in the U.S. Congress proposing legislation that would require greenhouse gas emission cuts of 20% by 2020 and 80%. 80%. That is a huge share of the overall total by 2050. And I'm a big fan of clip art, and so this is my collision. We have the policymakers and the reality headed for a serious collision. There is some good news. This is not an all bad news story. If you look at per capita electricity use, state by state, it varies incredibly. Now, people could fight for hours and days about what these numbers really mean. But for those of you who've been to California, I suspect you did not feel like you were electricity deprived when you were in California. I certainly don't. I've been to Rhode Island, same thing. I didn't feel electricity deprived. I grew up in New York. I go home to visit my mother on a regular basis. You know, the per capita electricity use in those three states is only slightly more than half the average, and 1/4 the per capita use in Wyoming, a little less than that in Kentucky. The District of Columbia, I will give you, is a special case. It has a small population that forms the per capita that is supporting a very large city with lots of offices and lots of computers and lots of air conditioning. So D.C. is not a good sample on this because of it being just a city and not a state. But the one thing you need to know about the difference between California, Rhode Island, and New York on the one hand, and Wyoming and Kentucky on the other hand, is power price and power policies have been very focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing the use of electricity, improving efficiency, particularly in California, for a very long time. Wyoming and Kentucky have very, very inexpensive power. And it's hard to create incentives to decrease use when you have very, very inexpensive power. So the conclusion I draw is that policies and price signals can make an important difference in how much electricity people use and, relatedly, what the greenhouse gas emissions associated with those are. Parallel realities. What do I mean here? We have lots of people out there with their solution, their perfect solution. Al Gore, who's done a lot of great things on climate change to increase awareness, makes the somewhat, in my view, extraordinary claim that we could achieve a carbon-free, nuclear-free power base in the U.S. in 10 years. And we only have to do two things. We need an electricity grid, in other words, power lines crossing the country, moving renewable resources, renewable electricity to where the people are, and a big carbon tax that he suggests should replace the payroll tax. So in other words, instead of paying Social Security tax, the carbon tax would go to support that. And he said, if you put those two policies together, we can get to a carbon-free, nuclear-free power resource in the U.S. You can tell by my remarks I'm a bit dubious about that. Scientific American. Now, this is an article in Scientific American. This is not an editorial policy of Scientific American, but on the last slide I give you a citation if you want to go read the article. The article suggested that for an investment of 0.5 cent per kilowatt hour, which would total $420 billion in subsidies, which until we had the stimulus legislation sounded like a big number. Now it's, very doable. This article suggests that solar could supply 70% of our electricity and 35% of all energy use in the U.S. It's a point of view. The American Wind Energy Association they have a lobbyist for wind power. Okay, this is the trade association who every day gets paid to come in and say the most favorable things you can say about wind energy and try to change policy to make the world friendly for wind power. What they say is that with the appropriate transmission support, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, wind could supply 20% of our power by 2030. These are the advocates, okay? Al Gore is saying 10 years, no problem, carbon-free, nuclear-free. That basically means wind. The trade association, the people who really know this industry and really want the best for it, say we can get to 20% by 2030. Another point of view. The Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, is the research body that is supported by the electric utility industry. So the electric utility industry members, local utilities, tend not to do research on technologies themselves, but they fund EPRI to think about how do we solve all sorts of problems in electricity supply, delivery, pricing, whatever. They've been around for a long time. Of late, they've been very focused on the climate change problem. And they say if you had the right set of national policies and $30 billion in research and development investment, small change these days, $30 billion, and you allowed the full portfolio of options, in other words, nothing is taken off the table as a matter of policy, you could get a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of 37% by 2050, the date by which Barack Obama says he would like 80% reduction, and you would have only a 45% increase in electricity prices. But some of the things they look at when they say that are we can improve efficiency, we can develop smart grids so that the electricity distribution system is supported by an elaborate array of software that enables users of electricity and suppliers of electricity to communicate to reduce their use of electricity based on price signals, based on policy. Smart grid means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but basically it's an efficiency measure, smarter use of electricity. And plug-in hybrid vehicles would be a big part of their full portfolio. Advanced transmission grid and power storage technologies for renewables. Right now we don't have any economic means to store electricity, really. I shouldn't say any. We have a few that work in specialized situations, but they're not available for large-scale implementation. Expanded nuclear power. They say their 37% increase assumes 45 new nuclear power plants. We have last proposed to build begun building a nuclear power plant in the early 1980s, and they're saying by 2050 we'd get 45 more on the grid. A heavy lift. And then advanced coal, new coal-burning power plants that include carbon capture and sequestration, technologies that are not commercially implemented anywhere today. So this is their prism. This is their full portfolio approach. If you look at the top line, that's what things would look like if things just continued in the direction we are today. And then they have all those different slices of reductions through efficiency, through renewables, through nuclear, through advanced coal generation, through carbon capture and sequestration. You see that's the biggest chunk because remember, roughly a third of the problem comes from coal-fired power plants, and then plug-in hybrids and distributed electricity. So they say if we do it all, we get a 37% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So we've got a problem. A lot of people like to say the U.S. has not responded from a policy standpoint, from a legal standpoint. And I think it's important to point out that the law has already responded in many different ways. So we ought to understand what those ways are that the law has already responded. We have international treaties and agreements. We have mandates. We have incentives of all sorts. We have direct intervention by government, and that takes a variety of forms. We have all sorts of smart regulation and regulatory reform designed to respond to the challenge of climate change. And then we have financial backing. Let's look a little more in detail at these. International agreements. I mentioned briefly at the outset the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The U.S. is a signatory to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which basically sounded the clarion call, this is a real problem that the world needs to respond to. It was premised on the idea that voluntary response would be sufficient. And it entailed a voluntary commitment to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions at 1990 levels to start on that road. Remember those charts back at the beginning that I showed 55% increase in Nevada in greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. So we're not doing too well on our United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And oh, by the way, neither is the rest of the world. So by about 1996, 97, it became clear that the voluntary approach wasn't working too well. And the international community got together and formulated the Kyoto Protocol. And that is an agreement under which all of the industrialized nations of the world, except the U.S., agreed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 5.2% by 2012. 5.2% by 2012. Pretty modest compared to what we're talking about now. But the difficulty is the industrialized nations was basically Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan. It left out China, it left out India, it left out all of what we think of as the developing world. China, India, Indonesia are some of the fastest growing emitters. A lot of people talk about how China has overtaken the U.S. as the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. I would point out, yes, that happened this year, or in 2008. So on an annual basis, in 2008, greenhouse gas emissions were greater in Japan than in China than in the U.S. But since 1950, the U.S. has been contributing a disproportionate share of the total of those atmospheric concentrations. So it is going to be a long time before China and India are as big contributors as the U.S. on a total basis. Not a distinction that they want to achieve, not a distinction that we want to see them succeed at, but it is the direction things are headed at the moment. Finally, there have been a number of international technology development agreements. Everybody recognizes we need to develop technology that will be more climate friendly, and there are lots of international agreements to promote that. The mandates within the U.S. that most directly address climate change that are already in place today, more than 25 states have imposed renewable portfolio standards. What does that mean? That means the states specify a certain percentage of the electricity supply within the state must come from renewable resources. And, you know, I say 25 plus because just about every day that number seems to go up. Appliance efficiency standards. Little known fact, incandescent light bulbs. 5% of the energy required for an incandescent light bulb provides light. 95% provides heat. My husband uses incandescent light bulbs to warm the engine of his little airplane in the winter because it's in an unheated hangar. So it works very effectively as a source of heat. It is a terrible source of light. Congress in 2007 said that by 2012 we're going to ban incandescent light bulbs. Would anybody like to guess how many pages of legislation it took to achieve a ban on incandescent light bulbs? Just take a wild guess. No, not that bad. 21 pages of legislative language to say we're going to stop using incandescent light bulbs by 2012. That's a little tiny part of the problem, and it took 21 pages of legislation. I'm pleased to say that in more general terms, the same energy legislation said we have to get better on more efficient washing machines, air conditioners, water heaters, home furnaces, industrial machines of all kinds. And these can make an enormous difference. And so those mandates are in place. It turns out that promulgating efficiency standards for appliances is one of the most difficult, politically most difficult jobs the Department of Energy is asked to undertake. It has taken them as much as 10, 15, 20 years to promulgate a standard for a single appliance. Anybody have any thoughts why that might be? There are communities in the United States where the employer is an appliance manufacturer. And if they're a little bit behind the curve on producing more efficient washing machines, dishwashers, whatever they are, they fight very hard to slow the process down till they can catch up so that they can meet the efficiency standards. When I was at the Department of Energy, the first 4 years I was at the Department of Energy was not my responsibility at all, and I barely knew what was going on. I just knew it was really, really hard. And then when I became general counsel and actually had to deal with it, it was like, oh, I get a headache any day I have to think about it because it's so hard, but it's important. Renewable fuel standards. In 2005, Congress for the first time said a portion of our transportation fuels should come from renewable fuels. By 2007, just 2 years later, they said, wait a minute, we were way too modest in our goals. And they dramatically increased the required percentages so that by 2022, 36 billion gallons of our transportation fuels must come from renewable resources. And that is structured so that the overwhelming portion after 2016 will come from climate-friendly renewable resources. We could have a big debate about how good corn ethanol is from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint. It is the worst of the renewable resources for transportation fuels. It's certainly better than gasoline from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint, but it is not nearly as good as some of the more advanced alternatives that are still being developed. Green building codes, many communities have adopted green building codes. These turn out to be very hard too because small businesses tend to be in the construction industry. Small businesses have a hard time adopting new technologies, and so they're resistant. But there are communities, Boulder, Austin, various places around the country that have gotten ahead on the green building bandwagon and helping out on that 40% of greenhouse gas emissions that come from buildings. Vehicle efficiency standards. My personal view is the first few efficiency standards that were put in place in the early 80s, probably the most successful energy independence, energy security policy we ever had, dramatically improved vehicle efficiency. And then we kind of fell off the bandwagon in a serious way, and it took until 2007 for Congress to say that by 2015 we have to do better. But those mandates are in place. The vehicle manufacturers are working on them. And then another form of mandate is increasingly we see prohibitions on new coal plants coming out of state legislatures, coming out of public utility commissions. And what they're saying is, although coal is our most abundant energy resource in the U.S., because of the greenhouse gas emissions problems, we should postpone building any new coal plants until we learn how to capture that CO2 that's emitted and do something safe with it. Additional forms of mandates that are focused directly on greenhouse gas emissions. We have state and regional initiatives. 10 northeastern states got together in what's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, and agreed among themselves that they would reduce greenhouse gas emissions from electric power only. That's the only sector that they focus on, reduced to 10% below 1990 levels by 2018. That program is in place. They are doing carbon credit trading already. They are making progress. Whether they'll get to the 10% below 1990 levels by 2018, we'll see. California tends to get a lot of ink for its Global Warming Solutions Act. And what it said was that it would reduce to 1990 levels by 2020 and look for further reductions thereafter, but the legislation didn't specify what those reductions would be. This is not just focused on the power sector, this is economy-wide, but if you remember the statistic on how California has the lowest electricity use per capita, they've done a lot of what the rest of the country still needs to do to be efficient in electricity use. So this is a big challenge for them because they start further along the path, at least on efficiency. They have not, their program is to be it's being put in place now, but the mandates have not taken effect quite yet. Following on what was done in the Northeast, 7 Western states and 4 Canadian provinces got together and said, we'd like, as a region, to achieve a reduction of 15% below 2005 levels by 2020. That 2005 is really important. Remember, I showed you Arizona was number 2 on the list of percentage increases between 1990 and 2004. So what they said is, we're going to sort of ignore that for the moment, and we're going to try to improve from the 2005 levels going forward. It's realistic. Those who think we need to do it all right now. I think that's a pretty modest approach, but it's a little bit more realistic. Because the Northeast didn't show, in most of the northeastern states, didn't have those kind of dramatic increases, a little bit more reasonable for them to focus on 1990. But when you're thinking about climate change legislation and how hard it's going to be to achieve the goals that are set out in legislation, a key thing to look at, absolutely critical, is what's the baseline year? Are we looking at 1990? Are we looking at 2005? Are we looking at something later than 2005? We're headed in a direction where we're going to increase every year. But if you have to take into account all that's happened since 1990, it's a lot tougher to get there. And the other form of greenhouse gas specific mandates that are in place in many, many states are greenhouse gas emissions inventory requirements. Not very interesting, except what you measure is a lot easier to regulate. You know what the problem is. You can start making judgments about where you can get to by when. So the fact that virtually every state now requires an inventorying of greenhouse gas emissions means they wanted to have a body of knowledge to build on as they see some climate change mandates coming down the road. So the next kind of response from the law is incentives. And America loves a tax incentive. Doesn't matter what the issue is. So we have plenty of those that are designed to be responsive to the challenge of climate change. Production tax credits for wind and certain other renewables. Investment tax credits for certain other renewables. An excise tax waiver for renewable fuels. Every gallon of gasoline you buy has an 18 or 19 cent federal tax. Basically, renewable fuels don't pay those. And then at the local level, you have all sorts of real estate tax breaks for new green industry. Communities and states want to draw in the industry of the future, the green industry, and they provide all sorts of real estate tax breaks. And I will tell you, my clients are all out there looking for those. Solar renewable energy credit programs. We talked about renewable portfolio standards, a requirement that a certain percentage of the total supply of electricity come from renewable resources. A number of states say, okay, we want 15% renewables and we want 5% solar. Right now, solar is more expensive than wind. Solar and wind, in most parts of the country, solar and wind represent the predominant source of renewable resources. And solar is a lot more expensive than wind. And by creating a separate requirement for solar, it's designed to help spur the development of solar, hopefully bring the cost down. But when you create a separate renewable energy requirement for solar, it makes the renewable energy credit programs a lot more attractive financially to solar developers. So it's a form of incentive. Feed-in tariffs. Feed-in tariffs are the utility regulators say to renewable energy suppliers, whatever renewable energy you bring to the grid, we will accept on the grid, and we will pay you a price, a designated price that's above the market price. Europe loves feed-in tariffs. They don't understand why we're doing these renewable portfolio standards. They say just give them a price and they will come. And we are starting to see some states talk about feed-in tariffs as an alternative approach to incentivize the development of renewable energy. So government as a direct intervener in the market takes lots of different forms. The government, state and federal, big purchasers of climate-friendly products and services. They purchase the beta version. You know, it's just come out of the pilot plant, and the federal government is told you must buy, whether it is hybrid vehicles or compressed natural gas vehicles or energy-efficient windows or energy-efficient water heaters, they are always the first ones to buy. And the idea is to build some demand, bring down the price so that hopefully others will follow. The government, Department of Energy in particular, but many states as well, directly intervene in the market by helping to pay for research and development. More recently, and that's historic, that's long time, Oklahoma has been a big beneficiary of Department of Energy funding for advanced research on oil and gas production. It is now moving to a broader range of technologies, but it's a historic way that the government intervenes to help make things happen. A newer approach is for the government to give grants for commercialization of new technologies. So we have something that's been through the pilot stage, it's been through the demonstration stage, looks like it's commercially viable, but it just needs a little push. And the government is now giving grants for those first-of-a-kind plants, or first-of-a-kind implementation. Smart grid is a good example. Another form of direct intervention, we talked about the importance of transmission for renewable energy. Transmission is very hard to build, and one of the authorities that exists today for building new transmission is if state approval processes for new transmission are not working too well, then after a year, the federal government can step in if it's in a critical electricity corridor. So the Department of Energy has so far determined there are two critical electricity corridors. One basically covers the East Coast, and one covers the Southwest from California to New Mexico, Nevada. It's designed to help speed up the process of siting new transmission. It's not working really well, and under debate for an energy bill in the Congress this year is to change that backstop authority to just the federal government taking over the transmission siting on the theory they'll do it faster, and I underscore theory. Weatherization programs, designed initially to help poor people when the prices of energy started to go up dramatically in the 70s and 80s, now also seen as having a huge benefit in terms of reducing the power needs of the homes of low-income people. Energy efficiency audits. Lots of utilities, at the behest of their state commissions, will provide energy audits for people to tell them how they can be more efficient. And then the last way that I want to mention that's an important way that the government directly intervenes in market choices is by doing studies and reporting data. People can make more intelligent decisions if they have more facts. And in fact, the government does a lot of studies and data reporting to tell people where we stand. Smart regulation. A little more of my clip art here. Approving enhanced rate of returns for renewables enabling transmission. The theory being if you pay people more for transmission, maybe you'll get it built. People who want it built are not the ones who are slowing the process. People who want to build it are not the ones slowing it down. But the theory is if you pay them more to do it, maybe they'll fight a little harder to get it done quickly. Decoupling utility profits from sales volumes. If a utility only serves to lose money when it encourages efficiency, that's not a real successful strategy. So the idea is to decouple utility profits from sales volumes, and state utility commissions are increasingly looking at that. Streamlining permitting for renewable resources and related environmental permitting. And there is a new regime in place for new nuclear plant licensing that is designed to make the process go faster. And then finally, cap and trade mechanisms to satisfy renewable portfolio standards, renewable fuel standards, and carbon limits. So if you have a requirement, a mandate that it's tough for you to meet, but somebody else can meet it less expensively, the idea is there are credits generated, and you can buy the credit instead of buying the renewable fuel. It may reduce transportation costs. It may reduce the cost of changing out your power resource, which tends to be very capital intensive. So cap and trade is widely viewed as a form of smart regulation. Not everybody would agree with that, but it generally falls in that category. Financial backing, and these are really brand new roles for the government to play. In 2005, Congress created an innovative energy technology loan guarantee program. It was designed to take the first-of-a-kind technology risk on new energy technologies that Wall Street doesn't like to take. Wall Street wants sure things. Wall Street these days, they just want to hide, it seems. But in 2005, they were saying, we'll be happy to lend the money to build plants 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, but we don't want to do number 1 because number 1 might not work, and so we don't want to take that risk. So the technologies that are covered by this loan guarantee program: new nuclear, coal gasification, which is a more efficient form of burning coal, carbon capture and sequestration from the coal-fired plants, advanced biofuels, advanced solar, efficient end-use technologies, hydrogen fuel cells, lots of different options that would qualify under this program. We talked about transportation being almost a third of the problem. There is, as of 2007, an advanced technology vehicle manufacturing program designed to provide loans for vehicle and component manufacturers that produce fuel-efficient vehicles that exceed the fuel efficiency requirements. So it's not, these are not for plants that just meet the requirements. They have to exceed by a substantial margin, whatever the current requirement is. And then ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which most people refer to as the stimulus bill, expands the idea of loan guarantees for energy projects to cover not just the innovative technologies, not the first-of-a-kind risk, but renewable energy and new transmission. The theory was a jobs program. So where does that leave energy today? Renewables. Until the downturn, the renewable energy industry was going gangbusters. It had a vibrant wind industry. Major players, large companies building wind every year so that the amount of wind supplied to the grid was doubling, tripling on a regular basis. A burgeoning solar industry, still more expensive, but attracting strong investment to bring that cost down. We talked about the renewable mandates in more than 25 states, and those have been enhanced by renewable energy certificate markets. These are markets that allow cap and trade in renewable power. And then lots of development of new technologies: wave power, ocean thermal, thin film, and utility scale solar. Lots of interesting technologies being developed. What are the challenges? Renewable energy is largely the child of tax credits, and we ought to be clear about that. Those have been the driving incentives that have gotten renewable energy into the market. But we've had a lack of a predictable tax policy. So the tax credits would be extended by Congress for a year, 2 years, 3 years. If you are a big company trying to create a business plan, you don't want to just know what you can do next year. You want to have a long-range plan, particularly if you are, for example, ordering wind turbines that have a 3-year waiting period to get them delivered to you. So you need a predictable tax policy. The interesting thing is that the renewable energy industry fought really hard in 2007, 2008 to get a long extension of the tax credits. They got only another 3-year extension. and then the downturn hit. And tax credits depend, in order to work, they depend on people having taxable income that the tax credits offset. And all the suppliers of the taxable income have gone into the negative, so they're not working too well. The stimulus bill said we're going to allow some of those tax credits to be converted to grants that will be the economic equivalent, but there'll be money up front to help get those projects going. We don't know yet how well that's going to work. It's brand new. Under debate this year, and in fact I think likely to pass this year, is a federal mandate, a federal renewable portfolio standard, so that instead of having state by state 20% by 2025, there will be a federal mandate, and the numbers that are being kicked around are 15% by 2015 and 25% by 2025. There's a regional challenge that has to be acknowledged here. Wind is the most cost-effective renewable energy. There is not much of a wind resource in the entire Southeast. I saw just yesterday, South Carolina is looking at doing offshore wind because they don't have any good onshore wind sites. But it makes it a lot more expensive for them if they just have to import the wind from places like Oklahoma, North Dakota, South Dakota, and it requires a lot of transmission that's not in place. The bottom line we have to recognize is that despite all the activity that's been going on, all the mandates that are already in place, non-hydro renewables today represent less than 3% of our total electricity supply. And let me just take a minute to talk about non-hydro. Large-scale hydro, the Hoover Dam, those projects, number one, are not going to happen again, and number two, are viewed by many as environmentally unfriendly. So in most renewable energy requirements, hydro does not qualify unless it's what's called run-of-the-river or low-head hydro, so that it's not interfering with fish, not interfering with the environment. Hoover Dam, Niagara Falls are a few very, very large hydro projects that represent a significant portion of our electricity in a couple of regions, but those are excluded because they're really not a source for the future. Wind is the king of renewables. We have 21,000 plus megawatts of installed capacity, but there are some important facts that we need to bring to bear when we think about wind. A very successful wind turbine, well located, well operated, has a capacity factor of roughly 20 to 30%. That means it's producing wind at its maximum capability roughly 20 to 30% of the time, and the rest of the time it's mostly not adding to the grid at all. If you compare that with a nuclear power plant, a well-operated nuclear power plant tends to have a capacity factor of in excess of 90%. So for installed capacity, you have to, 21,000 megawatts of installed capacity of wind sounds like the equivalent of 21 nuclear power plants. It's really 20 or 30% of 21 nuclear power plants because of the inability of wind to supply power to the grid so much of the time. Another problem with wind, peak wind is not coincident with peak demand. In much of the country, peak demand occurs between 2 o'clock in the afternoon and 6 o'clock in the evening, and wind tends to die at that time of day. A little bit of a problem. The good wind resources are generally not located near where the need for power is. The 5 most productive areas for producing wind in the U.S., North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Montana, and West Texas, have the best wind potential. Not too many people needing a lot of electricity in those locations. With the result that recently West Texas had a major meltdown because they're so heavily dependent on wind in Texas, and when they needed it, the wind wasn't there. New York State happens to be in the top 20 among wind potential states. It has 5% of the potential of North Dakota. The relevance of that is once you get past these top 5, you have a huge, huge drop-off in capability. And siting wind is not all that easy once you get out of the locations where there aren't too many people. Some people think they're ugly. Other people think they're beautiful. I put a picture in. You can decide, pretty, ugly. They kill birds. They kill a much smaller number of birds than skyscrapers, but nobody talks about skyscrapers killing birds. But nevertheless, there are siting challenges. Last line on this slide is just to tell you, we talked about the American Wind Energy Association saying they aspire to 20%. Today, in the U.S., wind is 1.5%. It's 7% in Germany, where they've had those nifty feed-in tariffs that say, you deliver it, we'll buy it. And in Denmark, where offshore wind is pretty well developed, they have 20%. Offshore wind is the place to look if we're going to greatly expand wind resources nearer where people are. But offshore wind is very expensive. Everybody loves solar. Have you ever heard anybody say anything bad about solar power? I've not. The current capacity is 3,400 megawatts. Remember we talked about capacity factor. I was reading a client document on the airplane coming out here yesterday, and they were bragging about their 9.64% capacity factor. So wind is 2030, solar. This is a challenge. Today, more than half of the solar power we have is just used for water heaters or swimming pools. The good news about solar is that it's better aligned to peak demand than wind. So the sun is shining most brightly when we tend to need the most power. But it goes to 0 at night, and I don't know about you, but I don't want my alarm clock to turn off in the middle of the night because the power is down. Storage for solar power is not presently economic. That is the future. We need to figure out how to store the energy that comes off the sun during the day so we can use it year-round. But the other thing about solar is, remember, Scientific American says 70% of our electricity can come from solar. That would only require 46,000 square miles, roughly 20% of the suitable southwestern desert. And it has to be the southwestern desert. You can't do that in New York, or the square mileage goes way up because they don't have as good a solar resource. Again, it is a resource. If we put it all there, it would not be near load. We'd need lots of transmission. On the other hand, a little-known fact is that New Jersey has the second largest installed solar capacity, and there's a good reason for that. State policy allows solar renewable energy credits to sell for up to, and in some cases in excess of, $500 a megawatt hour, compared to a market price of $50, $100 if, on expensive sunny hot days. So there's a pretty huge economic incentive, and the industry follows those incentives. Transmission. We keep coming back to transmission. Most renewables are transmission enabled. We need lots of transmission to support these dispersed energy resources like solar and wind. The NERC, the National Electric Reliability Council, the people in charge of making sure the power stays on, say that they see greenhouse gas issues and electric reliability on a collision course. I'm sure they'd love my little clip art. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission says to the industry, you should allow more time. They regulate transmission pricing. They say you should allow more time to build new transmission than you allow to build a nuclear power plant. start to finish. Nuclear power plant takes roughly a dozen years. So if the regulators who are in charge of making this happen say you need a dozen years, that's a pretty big challenge for quickly expanding our resources of renewable energy. Remember Al Gore, 10 years, nuclear free, carbon free. I don't know how he gets there. And we talked about the federal backstop authority for siting transmission because it's so difficult to do. So far, the authority's been in place since 2005, and it has not accelerated transmission siting. That's not to say it can't work, it just hasn't worked yet. And the reality is that renewable energy, because it tends to be lots and lots and lots of smaller sources spread out, needs a whole different kind of electricity grid than if you're relying upon large baseload plants. A big coal plant here, big nuclear plant here. They can get the power to where it's needed with a lot fewer lines and a lot more mileage covered than the renewables that take 46,000 square miles in the desert Southwest. Transmission solutions, maybe federal siting authority, maybe more FERC policies related to cost recovery, cost allocation commensurate with project scope. The rules for paying for new transmission were written with the big baseload generation in mind. So telling somebody, if you want to build a new coal plant or a new nuclear plant, you have to pay for the transmission to interconnect with the existing grid. And you have to bear all that cost until others come in and need some of that transmission. It worked okay. It's not working really well if you have a 100-megawatt wind farm, which is a big wind farm, needing to build new transmission. The cost allocation isn't commensurate with the size of the project. And then interconnection queues. You have to get in line to get interconnected with the electricity grid. In the Midwest, they have a 45-year waiting list for getting interconnected of wind projects. By the way, 90% of them will probably never get built, but people are going to get in the queue so that if they can go forward, they're in the queue, they have a chance of being considered. But the result has been, nobody was making a judgment. Nobody was kicking people out saying, no way you're ever going to build that project. And so attention wasn't really being paid to the projects that have the best hope of going forward. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is starting to pay attention to that issue. Nuclear is the only essentially CO2-free baseload generation resource. If we're worried about climate change, we should be taking a careful look at nuclear. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 gave the nuclear industry just about everything they wanted to kick off what they like to refer to as the nuclear renaissance. Risk insurance for the early movers, production tax credits like the ones wind power has long received, and loan guarantees for new plants. A lot of challenges. Wall Street remembers that in the 1970s and 1980s, when we built 104 nuclear power plants, 103 nuclear power plants were canceled. One of them on Long Island was canceled after it was fully built. The test runs had been done, so it was contaminated. It never provided power to the grid. Others were canceled at various points along the development scale, but the point is there were billions of dollars lost. Wall Street remembers that. Very high cost of constructing new nuclear, very high. In excess of $10 billion for one nuclear power plant. Very low operating costs, very low fuel costs. The cost is all up front. We're dealing with a lot of first-of-a-kind plant designs. They have not been proven. They have not gone through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensing process. Those all present challenges. And we don't yet have a solution to the nuclear waste issue. Carbon capture and storage. We talked about without carbon capture and storage, very hard to build new coal plants. Virtually many dozens of new coal plants have been canceled in the last several years because of the climate change concerns associated with coal plants that don't have carbon capture and storage. IGCC is Integrated Gasification Combined Cycle. It is a new form of coal generation. It's proven for for generating power with coal, 6,000 megawatts in the world, and it allows the pre-combustion capture of CO2. There's also a research program well underway for CO2 capture with advanced pulverized coal generation. So you're capturing the coal after capturing the CO2 after combustion. And there's enormous optimism that carbon sequestration can work. We have a lot of places around the country that appear to be geologically suited to capturing and sequestering carbon. But the challenges are, for the new technology, the IGCC, the reliability is lower, the cost is higher, and no one is building them. There were several in the pipeline, and they've all been canceled. For the new pulverized coal designs, carbon capture has a huge cost and a huge energy penalty. In effect, you need to build 3 coal plants to supply the power that 2 would otherwise supply if you want to capture the carbon, because capturing the carbon takes so much energy. And new coal plants without carbon sequestration are just an addition to the problem, not a solution. Lots of things that could be done to move this forward. EPA rulemaking on CO2 injection and storage. EPA has a very good record of regulating storage of materials far more hazardous than CO2, even in small quantities. They've started, they need to get that done. Carbon capture and sequestration R&D just needs lots of money to prove it up. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it regulates pipelines. They need to get ready for a CO2 pipeline network. And we don't have to over-worry about liability associated with sequestering CO2, but we probably need to give the federal government responsibility once these sequestration sites close. Companies are not going to want to take on a potential liability forever. And so there are insurance programs that could be self-paying, but get the companies off the hook so that 300 years from now somebody won't be tracking them down long after their records of what they did and whether they did it right are lost. Biofuels. Again, transportation represents roughly 1/3 of the problem. We talked about dramatic increase in the renewable fuels requirement and dramatic increase in the requirement that a big portion of that come from advanced biofuels that have a good greenhouse gas emissions profile. The government has also aggressively supported R&D for advanced biofuels. Aggressively, billions of dollars. On the vehicle side, Congress has increased fuel efficiency standards. The bailout bill from 2008, this is not the stimulus bill, but the bailout bill adopted or extended tax credits for hybrids and plug-in hybrids to make them more attractive to customers, and established a grant program for advanced batteries to make hybrid electric vehicles more attractive. The oil price spike of last year, now long forgotten it seems, and the economic downturn have actually compounded the positive impacts of these policies. People are focused on more fuel-efficient vehicles, to the point where the Energy Information Administration projects that by 2030, 38% of vehicles will be hybrids. And this is the first year they've included any hybrids at all. So that's what's happening on the energy front from the legal standpoint and from the industry standpoint. So when EIA looks at all of the mandates that are in place, all of the incentives that are in place, everything we're doing on the industry side, what do they conclude the future looks like? They say that by 2030, coal, oil, and natural gas will provide only 79% of our primary energy supply. So those of you who think oil and natural gas might go out of style, EIA would disagree. Down a little bit from 2007 levels, but still a big part of the total picture. They see no growth in oil consumption. So they see a flat level of consumption. This is in the U.S. in response to policy and price. They see renewables growing by 3.3% a year, representing a third of additions between now and 2030. Efficiency improvements offsetting some demand growth. Sharp increase in the use of hybrids and plug-in hybrids, but still greenhouse gas emissions, they project, will grow 0.3%. That's down a lot from 2.7% in 2007, but it's growing. Remember, the policymakers in Washington are talking about reductions of 80% by 2050. I need my collision clip art in here again. So in light of the fact that everything we're doing is not enough, Congress is seriously engaged now in the business of writing legislation that will require reductions on a nationwide basis in greenhouse gas emissions. And probably a dozen bills out there. People who are really going to matter in writing that legislation haven't completely shown their cards yet. It's going to be a very tough debate because the regional impacts, the differences in the burdens borne across regions are huge. This tends to be an issue that doesn't break down Democrats versus Republicans, but it breaks down by region. How hard is it going to be for our region of the country versus some other region to get to the targeted reduction? So the debate is going to be a tough one. But the issues that are going to be on the table, and the issues that, if you care about this issue, you should be watching, are obviously, first and foremost, when will the cuts come? When will they be required? And how deep will they be? Who's going to be covered and how? Remember, we talked about Reggie looking only at the electric power industry. The electric power industry is the easy one to hit. The expectation is to get to where we need to go, we're going to have to cover the whole economy, any significant emitter. The caps can be put on in the case of oil and gas at the wellhead, in the case of power plants at the stack, in the case of vehicles through fuel efficiency requirements, lots of different ways of how the regulations will be imposed. But my expectation is that we'll have a little bit of each of the versions of caps on emissions. When you have emissions limits, the way those are implemented are through allowances. The government issues you if you're a big emitter, they issue you a certain number of permissions to emit in tons of CO2. And the question is, how will they issue those? Will you have to buy them in an auction, or will they allocate some for free? The Obama administration and several people in important positions in the Congress have said we should auction them all. The Obama budget for 2010 already shows revenues coming in from those auctions being spent on health care reform. Lots and lots of money will be on the table if those are all auctioned. I think the folks in places like Ohio that are very heavily dependent on coal-fired generation are going to say, we cannot live with 100% auction. We have to get some for free, recognizing the number we get for free will go down every year. We'll have time to adjust. More issues for debate. Is there going to be a safety valve, some price cap on carbon? If it gets to that limit, you don't have to pay more. Will there be some form of protection for the poor? How large a role will offsets play? Offsets are somebody can do it more cheaply than you by growing trees, by collecting methane from a landfill, can they create, will there be offset credits that you can use to satisfy your allowance requirements? Will state greenhouse gas emissions programs be preempted? Remember, we talked about the Northeast, the West, California. And then how will developing countries and international trade be addressed? The U.S. said, we won't ratify Kyoto because it doesn't impose any burdens on the developing world, and there where the growth is coming from. Since Kyoto was adopted, that debate hasn't changed very much, and we don't have good answers to how we're going to address that issue. But here's my vision of the future, and I want to emphasize, each one of these pictures represents one or two or three of my clients. I have 2 clients with fabulous batteries for vehicles that will create electric vehicles with 100-mile range and 5-minute recharging. Cellulosic ethanol. I have 3 advanced ethanol clients. One makes ethanol from garbage, post-recycling, take the newspaper out, take the aluminum cans out, take the metal out, and through a gasification process, they create ethanol. Fabulous technology. And they produce, because you produce your garbage where people are, they produce their ethanol where people are. Solar, thin film solar. You think of solar roofs. There's concentrating solar that depends on large areas of the desert Southwest. But this is an alternative, sort of a mid-sized solar installation that works in a lot more places using thin film solar that's less expensive. Got several clients working on those technologies. You recognize the stack from the nuclear power plant. The important thing to look at is the reactor in the background. It's very funny. If you do Google Images, nuclear power plant, you get a bunch of stacks that are this is where the water cooling goes on. And you get very few that picture the actual reactor, which is that little containment vessel in the background. But lots of clients working on advanced nuclear power plants. And then up in the top right-hand corner, a nifty little client that is using sustainably harvested wood pellets for industrial uses for heat and power in the Northeast. These are things that are happening today. They're going to continue to grow as a part of the solution, but the point is we need lots of solutions, and even then it's going to be a pretty dramatic challenge. But that's my upbeat place to finish. I talked way too long, but I hope we can have some dialogue. Questions? Points of view? Where I'm wrong? Why you disagree? Yes. The question is, do I predict that a cap and trade bill will get enacted this year? And the answer is no. The folks who are driving the bus on cap and trade are really, really liberal. And they have really, really aggressive goals that they want to enact. And I don't think they've come to grips with the resistance that will come from the fact of the economic downturn, from the regional dislocations some of their approaches would cause, and it's very hard for me to imagine them reaching the compromises that are going to be necessary to get a bill through this year. But they're going to try. I mean, they're talking about it. Yes? You see these pictures? All of these technologies require new manufacturing in the U.S. They hire people. The gas stations don't disappear. Those cellulosic ethanol guys, they blend with gasoline. Right now, the blend limit is 10% ethanol. There's a big debate ongoing, can we move it up to 15%? The gas stations are all going to be there. We're moving towards some flex fuel vehicles that would allow a higher percentage. Even those will be blend, but you know, it will be the gas station will be there. On the batteries, it's really exciting. The battery loan program that's in place requires U.S. manufacture. We fell behind on developing these advanced batteries. People are bringing the technology from China, from Korea, here to build new manufacturing facilities, and they have pretty dramatic rollout strategies. If they can just get that first couple plants built, get those first few thousand batteries into cars and show that they work, those will be jobs in the U.S. The solar industry provides huge amount of jobs in the U.S. Solar installation provides jobs locally. Anywhere you're installing solar, you need local solar installers. And you have the solar manufacturing. Some of it's going on in Europe, some of it's going on in Asia, but a lot of it's going on in the U.S. Nuclear power plants have a very good employment record, and those are very high-paying jobs. They tend to be the highest-paying jobs in their communities. So there is dislocation. There is change involves change for some people. People need to be getting ready for it, and the government needs to be helping people get ready for these new things. And all of them, I shouldn't say all, most of them cost more than we're paying for power net. So you need to combine it with efficiency so people are buying less. Energy efficiency turns out to be a pretty job-intensive business too. So I'm not too worried about jobs in the long run. I am worried about the economic dislocation at a time of economic distress. That's part of the reason why I'm dubious we'll get carbon legislation this year. Yes?
Talk a bit about direct government. Not about either one of them. I think gas is it.
The question is about the collision between our trade commitments, our trade obligations, and incentives, subsidies, forms of government intervention. It's a fabulous question. It is a really hard issue. And when those trade issues come up, I call up a guy whose name is Louis Leibowitz. He's my partner. He's one of my trade partners. And we've actually done some speaking engagements together where he talks about all the different ways that we might, in a cap and trade system, try to address the problem of goods coming into the country cheaper because they don't bear the burden of carbon regulation. And then when we adopt biofuels policies that create subsidies. And it is incredibly complex. Most of the solutions that are being kicked around probably do violate our trade agreements, and we don't have good answers to those questions. I think those have to be dealt with in the successor agreement to Kyoto, so that we're not in violation of our trade agreements. But it is a really tough problem. Yes.
On that,
the question is, how do we move sustainable technologies to the third world so that if we reduce our carbon emissions, we don't just see them increasing elsewhere in the developing world. Some of those fancy new batteries that we're going to be producing in the U.S., we need to export. In fact, one of my clients has very much focused on the export market for his batteries. And we keep saying, yeah, but part of the goal is to produce fuel-efficient vehicles that are riding around in the U.S. too. And so a lot of these technologies, once they are truly commercialized, will compete with the traditional technologies. China is using U.S. nuclear power plant designs to replace some of the coal-fired generation. Some of the international technology development agreements have particularly focused on Asia, where the greenhouse gas emissions are increasing the most, to try to make sure that in these developing economies, which, by the way, start out much more fuel efficient than we do, so that helps. The hill is not as high as it might be. That they, as they develop their economies, they incorporate more climate-friendly technologies. But until the price comes down on those technologies, that's a heavy burden for developing countries to bear, and we don't have perfect solutions. Yes?
There's obviously a gap between our emission reductions, those technologies.
We're not hearing about it in power generation because it is so well established. It is the technology choice that has been underway really since the 90s. Replacing coal with natural gas. An enormous amount of gas generation was built in the 90s, in the early 2000s, because people saw carbon limits coming, and it's also cheaper to build a gas plant than it is to build a coal plant. The problem is the price of gas tends to be very volatile, gets very expensive. It, of course, does have greenhouse gas emissions, but they are half of what's coal. But it is definitely the transition technology of choice. It is certainly what the utilities are focused on. And I think you don't hear a lot of discussion about it because the technologies are well understood and the strategy is well underway. In the transportation sector, I think the reason you don't hear more about it is because it does require a new infrastructure. Whereas ethanol just requires a blender who comes in and basically dumps a bunch of ethanol into gasoline. It's a very low-tech way to introduce a lower greenhouse gas emitting fuel. For compressed natural gas, you need a new infrastructure. It is widely used in large cities for buses, and because it's very clean, it solves a lot of air pollution problems. And I think will again serve as a transition technology as these others come along more slowly. Industrial users of natural gas have been very frustrated by the use of natural gas for power generation and transportation because it competes for industrial, it drives the price up for the industrials, and they don't have good substitutes. So I think the natural gas industry is going to be in fine shape for as far as the eye can see. The question focused in particular on Pennsylvania, but it certainly applies in lots of states around the U.S., is what are the solutions for communities that are very heavily dependent on coal? And it's good you asked the question about Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania has actually had a very forward-looking energy policy for a decade, and they recognize that they need to transition to more renewables, that they need to transition to cleaner coal. Doesn't make clean coal cheap. It doesn't make carbon capture and sequestration easy. Pennsylvania happens to be a state very well suited for carbon sequestration. I think you can anticipate in the 2020s, 2030s, there will be, we're going to have to use our coal. It is our largest energy resource. We're just going to have to find a way to do it in a way that's climate friendly. And I think Pennsylvania will probably be, at the head of the pack, because a lot of forward-looking thinking going on, tempered by the economic reality that you can't start from scratch. You have to start where you are. Yes?
Climate change initiatives.
The question is that climate change and response to climate change has a reputation for being a bit elitist, and how do we get beyond the elitist crowd that's already on board and sell these policies to a larger portion of the population? And I go back to my last slide, my vision of the future, which has lots of good jobs for people in communities that need jobs. We bring them solutions they can afford. We do things like the stimulus bill funding weatherization programs to a level they've not been funded in a very long time. That goes directly to lower income communities. When we build housing for lower income people, we use the best building technologies available, the most energy efficient technology. You have to prove it. You're right. It has had Al Gore and the elitists having a private conversation about how the rest of us are going to live, and it does have to expand beyond that. On the other hand, if the scientists are right, and I'm not prepared to dispute with the thousands of scientists that have been studying this for decades, we've got to move ahead and have the conversation and the progress at the same time. We can't get everybody persuaded before we start to move.
I want to remind everybody that Marianne will be visiting informally with students and anybody else who wants to join us in the USC Family Native American Reading Room and the Maybe Legal Information. 3 o'clock, I talk about careers in climate change and energy. If I might add, in response to the question about elitism, I believe Walmart is one of the leading.
I bet I do a lot of work for on climate change.
Adjusting to climate change. I want to thank again our student editors, Kyle, Zach, and their colleagues, and Marianne Doyleson will give us.
If you want me to talk about metaphysics, it's not happening.
Thank you.